count to 5, please, sir.
Yeah, give us a count to 5. Just want to do a mic check.
Okay. 1,
Check.
2, 3, 4, 5.
Very good, thank you.
Yeah, we good. We good. All right, stand by.
Okay, tape is rolling.
Okay. If you could just please give me your name and where you're from.
I'm Earl P. Cook. I live here in Atlanta now.
How long have you lived in Atlanta?
Oh, some 30 years, I guess. This time. We lived here prior to that time.
And where were you born?
I was born in Troup County, Georgia, south of Atlanta, LaGrange, Georgia,
How long did you live there?
until I was about 15 years old. And then I came to Atlanta and went to high school and Georgia Tech.
You joined the military about mid-41, right?
Yes, I was at Georgia Tech, and I received my commission as a second lieutenant at Georgia Tech. And in August of 1941, all reserve officers were called on active duty, and I was activated and was sent down to Camp Stewart, Georgia, near Savannah. And that began my military career in World War II.
Tell me a little bit about why you wanted to be in the military.
Well, I took ROTC at Tech High School here in Atlanta, and then I continued ROTC at Georgia Tech, and so it just was natural that I would continue the school ROTC program, and of course I didn't know that we were going to be called up into active duty so soon, but that's the way it turned out. Just a short time before Pearl Harbor, actually, August before December the 7th.
What was the feeling in the reserves at that point, just before Pearl Harbor?
Well, I guess we all were concerned about the world affairs that were going on at that time. I was sent immediately down to this camp at Camp Stewart, Georgia, and we were busy, organizing our training and getting trained, and then from there we went up to maneuvers in North Carolina, and then when Pearl Harbor came, that was a different story altogether. Everybody got really concerned about the world affairs and what was going on, and for me, actually, I was sent overseas in January in 1942, so it wasn't long after Pearl Harbor that I was on my way to the Pacific.
Tell me about your personal experience of December 7th. Where were you at? What were you thinking?
Well, actually, just prior to that, I was up in North Carolina on maneuvers, and I was able to come home for the weekend to Atlanta, and I was at our church, St. Mark Methodist Church here in Atlanta, with a meeting of the Young People's Department, as we called it then, and that's when we heard about Pearl Harbor. And we immediately after that Sunday night, the next day, I was on my way back to North Carolina to the maneuvers area, and then things started happening fast, and next thing I knew, I was up at Fort Wadsworth, New York, and from there to the port of embarkation. I guess we were all in a state of shock at that time. I mean, we didn't realize, I suppose we didn't realize how serious it was, but we knew that when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and did all the damage there, that we knew that we were in for some hard times ahead. And then soon after that, of course, we were in the war in Europe, and that kind of got everybody organized from a war footing. As we've often said, and World War II was probably the only war that we will be in the future that we were, as a nation, united. Because, and of course, even there were there were people who were pacifists who felt like that we shouldn't fight, but it was a situation where we had to defend our country, and those of us that were in the service had no problem with that at all.
So you shipped out from New York. Tell me a little bit about how you got from New York to the Pacific.
Well, as I say, we were at Fort Wadsworth, New Jersey, and I was assigned to be a second lieutenant in charge of about 20 enlisted men, Signal Corps enlisted men. And we became a part of what was known as a task force that included infantry regiments and artillery and quartermaster and medics and all the units that go along to maintain an organization such as a division. So we boarded a ship at the Brooklyn Navy Yard on January the 22nd of 1942, I believe. And we went down the East Coast to Carolinas and Florida and down to the Panama Canal. We crossed through the Panama Canal, which I remember at that time was covered with big barrage balloons. These balloons were supported by cables, and that was done to protect the canal from any enemy bombers that might try to destroy the canal. We went through the canal, and then we headed out to the Pacific. We were out in the Pacific for 39 days, zigzagging across the Pacific in order to avoid Japanese submarines. That were a lot of them in the Pacific at that time. And after 39 days of that zigzagging, which was an experience in itself. By the way, we were on, I guess there were probably 15 ships in our convoy, plus Navy cruisers and escorts. We were on ships that were formerly cruise ships that had been outfitted for troop ships. I was on a ship formerly known as the Santa Rosa, and it, I think, was in the service to South America along the East Coast. But it was outfitted for troops, and they had bunks, not the kind you see in the Navy, but they were canvas bunks about 4 high and crowded into small rooms. And that's the way we lived for that 39 days. We did have showers, salt water showers, which were very unsatisfactory. And we were fed 2 meals a day. And one of the things that some of the officers were assigned to be on watch. And one of my assignments was to be in the crow's nest, climbing way up a mast and getting in a little metal cylindrical place and spend about 2 hours there as watching with a telephone back to the bridge. But fortunately, I never saw anything to report. We had a really, I guess, looking back on it, it was an uneventful trip across the Pacific, and we landed in Australia, at Melbourne, Australia. And I was with my 20 men, and we were assigned to camp in Australia, Camp Victoria. I believe it was that was the name of the place that we stayed for about 2 weeks. And after that, we were told to get ourselves back on ships, not knowing where we were going at the time, at least not for people like second lieutenants. But we ended up going to New Caledonia, and we were the first military troops into New Caledonia. And we were welcome there. It's a French possession, and it still is today. We were welcome there because the French people there felt like that our presence there had kept the Japanese from conquering the island and setting up a real roadblock between the United States and Australia, because New Caledonia was a very strategic place from that standpoint. So we landed in New Caledonia, and we got ourselves situated. My little group, we found a former Japanese department store, and we moved in and set up signal repair facilities there, and we repaired radios and telephones, switchboards, and all kinds of communications equipment for all branches of the service. There was a big Navy installation there, lots of ships out there. They have a big harbor. And part of our task force was sent up the island to guard the upper parts of that long island. And after a few months, it was decided that our task force should be converted into a regular division. And a normal division at that time consisted of about 3 infantry regiments and 3 or 4 artillery battalions and quartermasters and medics and all the things that a normal division has. So we formed this division, and it was decided to give it a number instead of a name instead of a number, because most divisions had numbers, most units had numbers. One of the fellows in my division suggested the name Americal for Americans in Caledonia, and it was the General Patch, who was our division commander, decided that was a good name, and that was the name that our division had for the rest of the war. And after we'd been at New Caledonia for, what did I say, maybe 4 or 5 months, then we, as this division, we were sent up to Guadalcanal to following the Marines. We did not land with the Marines, but we were right behind the Marines. And we stayed there cleaning up the island for about 4 or 5 months. Following that, we went down to Fiji. Do you want all this detail?
Yeah, please.
We went down to Fiji, and that's after we were needed to have rest and recuperation and get over malaria. Nearly everybody had some degree of malaria. And we finally got down there, and it was a very beautiful place to be, except that not under those conditions. And after we'd been there for some time and got additional troops and additional training and so forth, then I was transferred from this little group of repairmen to a signal company, which is a normal part of an infantry division. And the signal company then operated as I was a part of the operation of the signal company's normal duties, and we provided communications from the division headquarters to all the units, wire communications and radio communications and messenger communications. And that was our job on Guadalcanal, and also that was our job on Fiji. After that, we also were able to do a little traveling around the island as the best we could on the time that we had. But then the time came for us to get reorganized again and go up to Bougainville. That's another island in the Solomon chain. And we did the same thing on Bougainville that we did on Guadalcanal. We finished up mopping up the Japanese that was still left there after the Japanese had been pretty well subdued, but there was still a lot of them around shooting at us and dropping bombs on us and shelling us and so forth. One night on Bougainville, we had a red alert, as we called it, and I went into my foxhole. We all went and had foxholes dug in the sand and with coconut logs on top of it to protect us. And there was one of the things that bothered us a lot there was that the Japanese sent this 1 or 2 small, medium-sized bombers over, and they would just fly around and occasionally would drop a bomb. I mean, they would just stay up there for 2 or 3 hours, it seemed. And you never knew when the bomb was going to be dropped or where it was going to fall. and finally they would drop one here or there. One night they dropped one near us, and when I came back after the raid was over, I came back to my bunk, and there on the bunk was this jagged piece of shrapnel. It had come through the tent, down through the mosquito netting that we had over our bunks, and was lying right on my bunk where I would have been lying if I'd been there. I still have that piece of shrapnel, by the way. But and that was a bad part of being there. The Japanese planes, we used to call it Washing Machine Charlie. It sounded like a small engine going flying around up there, and it would keep us awake, hours during the night. Then the next day you'd feel kind of groggy, and you just didn't feel too good, not having had a good night's sleep. But from there on to after Bougainville, I said more or less the same thing. We went from there to the Philippines, and we landed on Leyte. And that's where our division joined up with other divisions in the Philippine operation. And by the time I was in Leyte, by that time I made captain. I was company commander of the signal company there, 26th Signal Company of the Marical Division. And by that time, I had enough points to be returned to the United States. Now what I've just talked about is 3.5 years solid, with no chance to come home, and no satellite TV, and no satellite telephones, and no communications with home other than letters that were very slow coming. Our mail service out in the Pacific was not too good then. And of course we didn't have the luxury of the communications that the military has this day and time. But then I was able to come home from the Philippines and went back to San Francisco. We didn't have to do any, at that time the sea was pretty clear of Japanese subs, so we didn't have to do any zigzagging, and we came directly to San Francisco. Arrived at San Francisco, by the way, the day that Franklin Roosevelt died. And of course that was a shock to everybody, particularly those of us from Georgia who realized that he died at Warm Springs. And we were there for a few days getting debriefed and so forth, and then it came my lot to be assigned as a troop train commander to come across the United States with a troop train full of soldiers who were returning from the Pacific like I was, and we had some 20 cars in the train, I guess, pulled by a steam engine. And it was not hot, but it was not cold either, but the cinders and the soot from that train came all over in the train. We had our share of dirt and soot. No chance to get cleaned on that train. And it was about 5 days across the country from San Francisco to Fort McPherson here in Atlanta, where I ended my tour as train commander, thank goodness. One of the interesting things that happened there was out in the west somewhere, well, whenever the train had to stop to take on water, as they did then, if there was a bar or store nearby, some of the guys would slip off the train. Although we tried to keep everybody on the train, they'd go get a few bottles of beer and get back on the train. And we had some trouble with one of them. He got up in the engine, was shoveling coal, helping them shovel coal into the engine, and the engineer came back and said, "Captain Cook, you just got to get this man out of there. We can't use him up there." So we got him off. He was all covered with soot and coal dust, but those are just little things that happened. And we had kitchens on the train to feed the troops. I think we had 2 meals a day, such as they were. But we were also glad to be home, that we really didn't mind some of the inconveniences of that trip. I got back to Atlanta, and I was given 2 weeks leave and spent it with the family and friends. And then and I was sent down to Miami for a rest and recuperation period and debriefing period down there. And after that, I was assigned to the Signal Corps Board in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. That assignment had to do with developing and testing and coming up with new signal equipment to be used in the future by communications units in the service, whether it be not all Signal Corps, but used by other units too. And our job was to test equipment and make recommendations to manufacturers to make changes and improve the radios, telephones, switchboards, and all the various things. And I was there for the rest of the time that I was in service, and I was discharged in 1945 as a major. That's my history.
Well, it's a very good summation of 3.5 years.
Okay.
Actually, let me go into just a few details about your time in the Pacific. How was the food?
Well, the food was not too bad. Fortunately, I was able to eat in the officers' messes. The officers ate separately from the enlisted people, but I think we essentially had the same food. We had no fresh food most of the time. Certainly not on the boat going over. We had nothing fresh there, and no ice cream and no Cokes. And when we got to Caledonia, we were able to get some fresh food there. Some of the fellows who liked to hunt, they went up in the island and shot some deer, and we had some venison for a few weeks, I guess. But most of the time it was food that was brought over, provided by the quartermaster, and it was generally canned. And I don't think we had much frozen food in those days, because frozen food was not as readily available then as it is now.
Did you write home very often?
Yes, I wrote home fairly often. Matter of fact, my family kept all the letters that I wrote, and I have them now. Other way around, though, the mail from here out there was always late, slow, and would come in batches. When you got any, you'd usually get 4 or 5 letters. And every now and then somebody would send me portions of the Atlanta Constitution to read, and that gave me a little touch with Atlanta and home. The magazines that we got were all real old by the time we got them. V-mail was in existence then. I don't know if you're familiar with V-mail. It was a system where people back here could write on a certain form, and post office would take it and would microfilm it, or whatever they called it at that time, and put it on film and fly it out there to some place, perhaps in Australia, and then it would be printed from the film, and then it would be sent to the units. But that never was very satisfactory. We just never enjoyed V-mail where I was. Maybe in other places it was satisfactory.
Having lived in Atlanta and everything, do you remember at all when you were around Guadalcanal hearing about the loss of the Atlanta, the USS Atlanta?
Oh yes.
Tell me a little bit about hearing about that.
Well, while we were there, of course, and before we got there, I got there in late November, I believe, in December, and I believe the battle where we lost the Atlanta, unfortunately due to our own fire, I really just knew about it, and I knew at times when we were there was some naval activity while we were there, but I was not there when the bulk of the Navy fighting was going on there. there were so many ships sunk right off of Guadalcanal that area there was known as, and is known today as, Iron Bottom Sound, where the Atlanta was lying on the bottom, and many other military ships, American and Japanese and Australian, I guess too. They are still on the ocean floor right there, right off of Guadalcanal. We went back there back in 1992. A bunch of us, maybe as many as 1,000 of us, had contributed through the years to a memorial to the military people that served on Guadalcanal. And we went back there on August the 7th, 1992, 50 years from the time that we first landed on Guadalcanal. And we dedicated a beautiful memorial that's still there today. And those of us that went back there for the first time since we were there 50 years ago were pretty emotional about being back. It was a great experience. Dedicated a beautiful memorial there, and it's being maintained and kept up now. However, we found out that the Japanese have moved into Guadalcanal, and they have a big economic involvement there. They have a big, at least that time, and I suspect it still exists, they have a big fishing industry off Guadalcanal in the ocean there, and they have these big fishing fleets that catch fish, and they have the big ships out there that can and freeze the fish, because Japanese, of course, eat a lot of fish. And it is a big industry in Guadalcanal, off Guadalcanal. It's in the Pacific all around, I think. The Japanese have spent a lot of money on Guadalcanal. They have paved the main area there, the main road. It's now paved. And when we stayed there in 1992, there was a small motel there that we stayed in. It was didn't compare with our Holiday Inns or anything, but it was adequate, and it was owned by the Japanese. So the Japanese, although they may have lost the battle, I think they won the war economically.
Of the Japanese, what did you think of your enemy at the time?
Well, we just naturally felt like they were almost barbaric at times. Some of the things that happened, the way they would treat our soldiers and our operations, they were ruthless, really, absolutely ruthless. And it was really we just had no feeling other than we were against anything that they did or they stood for, and particularly after attacking Pearl Harbor, of course, that just set the stage for our feeling that they were just out to conquer the world, and it was either them or us. And I'll have to say this, I felt the same way about dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There are people now, this day and time, who criticize America for dropping the bombs. And it was terrible, and I feel bad about all the people that were killed and the innocent people that were injured, killed, and maimed. But at the time, if the bombs had not been dropped, I might not be sitting here today. It was that serious at the time. And of course, soon after the bombs were dropped, the Japanese surrendered. But if the bombs had not been dropped, I think we would have been, the Allies, all of us, would have been forced to invade Japan, and they were guaranteed, I'm sure from things that we've read and learned, they were ready to fight to the death, no matter how long it took, in hand-to-hand combat on the island of Japan. And of course, if that had happened, we would have lost thousands and thousands of American allies in the invasion of Japan.
You answered my next question before I even had to ask it. What effect did World War II have on you personally?
Well, I think World War II and the experiences that I had and the travels that I was on and going to all those places in the Pacific, it gave me I'm sure it broadened my outlook of the world, because I was just a Georgia boy, you know. I'd never been too far afield from Atlanta and Georgia. But the experience of being on those islands and seeing Australia and the islands in the Solomons and in the Philippines, it was a great experience, and I will always remember it. I made some great friends while I was out there. And I guess it mainly just, in today's language, you might say it gave me more of a global outlook of the world than I would have had otherwise. Made some great friends in the military that I was associated with. Many of them were from New England and Massachusetts. And after the war, I was able to continue in touch with them, and I'm still in touch with those that we still know and are still living. But made some great friends during the service.
Tell me a little bit about the men that served under you.
About the men?
About the men that served directly under you.
Well, they were people who were had Signal Corps training. There were about 20 of them who they were specialists in radio and specialists in telephone repair and switchboards, and 2 or 3 of them had been with the Bell system before they came in, and they had some telephone or communications experience. Others had been trained to do this repair work, and so they were pretty capable folks, and I think they were able to do the job that we called on them to do.
There are, of course, innumerable greater effects that the war had on the United States from the time it ended until now that are still with us. What are one or two of the largest, most far-reaching effects that you think the war had on the nation as a whole?
Well, I suspect that one of the things that came out of it, as far as our country was concerned, is that we learned, or should have learned, that we are vulnerable. We are, in today's world, the terrorist activities that are going on, we're even more so, I suppose. But I think that before Pearl Harbor, we probably felt like that we were a fortress that nobody would even consider doing anything to. And I think that was one thing that we probably learned. And also, I suspect that, although it didn't affect me because I was not here, but I suspect that the people back here during the war who had to put up with rationing and had to live with a lot of gasoline and sugar and meat shortages that made them realize how fortunate we were then and as we are today to have the luxury that we enjoy. So it probably did, as a nation, it made us more aware of you might say, the blessings that we have as a nation in America.
This exhibit will be seen by literally thousands of kids that come through, and they'll of course see these videos. What do you want to impress on them to know and to remember about the war?
I would hope that the younger generation that sees this exhibit and hears about our activities of World War II will realize that freedom is not free. If we had not won World War II, there's no telling what we would have been subjected to. And I hope that the young people today understand that they have a part in trying to maintain our freedom in this country. And it would seem to me that the young people today need to have some experience of service, not necessarily in the military, but it wouldn't hurt a lot of them to be in the military for a couple of years. But if not that, to be able to give at least a couple of years of their life in some kind of service to the country that would affect the country or the area in which they live. I think that's important, that young people today may not appreciate what it means to serve their country or do something for their country. And I hope that this will be made aware of the young people today that see this exhibit.
What singular event from your time in service made the largest impression on you, or that you remember the most often? What was that event?
Well, I suspect that the thing that was most memorable to me was the experience on Guadalcanal, because that was the first time, of course, I and many others had been that close to actual combat, and actually knowing that a shell might land on us at night or as we were doing our job. And I think that was the kind of a wake-up call for those of us who were there and in service. See, we were not in the regular army, at least I and most of my fellows were. We were either enlistees or received our commissions and, from ROTC or something like that. So being in Guadalcanal and being there when the Japanese were very strong, and then watching the military activity that cleared out their troops, and we finally were able to say that we had the island under control. But that whole experience in Guadalcanal, I guess, was most memorable to me because it was my first experience in war.
Just a couple more questions. First, in your opinion, has the United States of 2004 earned the sacrifices made by the United States of 60 years ago?
Have we earned the sacrifices?
Have subsequent generations made themselves worthy of the sacrifices made?
Well, sometimes I'm afraid that the present generation is not aware of what happened during World War II. I mean, so many people that, that there are very few of us left. Veterans are dying now at the rate of about 1,500 a day. And I suspect that the present generation does not understand what we went through at that time. And I hope that as time goes on, maybe exhibits like this one that you are preparing might serve to let those who see it in 2004 and 5 perhaps understand what took place in World War II and know the significance of it.
One last question. Why is it important, and this is one of those obvious questions, but I want to get your opinion on it. Why is it important that this nation remember your generation?
Well, I hope that our generation is remembered for how we responded in World War II, and also that this generation realize that in order to be effective, we need to look back and see what happened during this time. I just think that, we've been called the greatest generation, and that may be a stretch, but those of us who went through that period of time, I think, understand that we were there because we were united in what we were doing, and we felt like that we were contributing very effectively to the future of America at that time. So I'm glad I was a part of it. I'm sorry that things happened, but I think it was something that had to be done, and we had to be strong and stand up for what was right at that time for our country.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you, or we haven't covered that you would like to address?
Well, I just would like to say that I appreciate the attention that is being given to programs like you are involving us in now, because I think it's important that we leave some legacy of what happened to us and to this nation during World War II. So I commend you and all those who are working on this program to set up a program that will be useful to show school children, young people, how important it is to be true to the country and be willing to contribute whatever they can to the future of this great country.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think that'll cover that.
Yeah, we're going to check tapes. One of the decks may have developed an audio problem.